Well, look, first of all, warm thanks to my two wonderful colleagues, Ellie and Hannah, for what they have done. As anybody who's worked on the site will know, I would be pretty useless without people like them, especially them perhaps in relation to the work on the malting complex. As they've both alluded to, what I'm going to do is sort of try and zoom out a bit to the wider landscape. First of all, the wider the wider Sedgeford landscape, and then the region as a whole, and think a bit about connections and flows. And that feeds into an argument really about the nature of the Middle Anglo-Saxon political economy within which Sedgeford was, I think, embedded. And some of this will be relatively controversial because I'm not remotely convinced by a lot of what is written about the way in which the Middle Anglo-Saxon economy was actually working. So it's an early medieval landscape transformed. It's not just about the malting complex, it's about something broader. It's also about what is unquestionably something that can meaningfully be described, I think, as an agricultural revolution being fitted into a wider context. And I'm going to start with our pots. And I'm going to, I'm going to say right away about our pots that we have to understand why we have this extraordinary assemblage of a very distinctive class of material. And although I'm repeating in relation to Ipswich ware something that will be familiar to probably pretty well everybody on the call, I want to underline the oddness of this material in archaeological terms. I'm not quite sure where we stand, incidentally, at Sedgeford in the league table. I think we might be number 3 after Ipswich and Brandon in terms of our sherd count, but we're certainly up there in the top division. We have an enormous quantity of Ipswich ware on the site. The current approximate count is, as you can see, about 4,500 for the settlement site. I'm not actually talking here about the malting complex. I'm talking about the settlements site. That's the 2 excavations which are listed up here. Now, what sometimes happens with this kind of material is people try to talk about cultural identity. They try to talk about cultural identity in relation to ceramics, in relation to artifactual material more generally. I think for a generation, an obsession about cultural identity has been a feature of the discipline, and I'm really not convinced by an awful lot of what is said about it. So in answer to my question, signifying what, I don't think it's got much to do with cultural identity any more than my cultural identity is encapsulated by the Tesco bag that I use to carry my shopping back from the supermarket. Cultural identities anyway, they're constructs, and they are very fluid constructs. Cultural identities are multiple. Many people have more than one cultural identity, certainly more than one social identity, and they are overlapping. And critically for us as archaeologists, it's extremely, notoriously difficult to read past cultural identities through artifacts. I think that there's an awful lot of very dubious reasoning that is built on a very shaky material foundation. If you were to ask me whether or not the people of Sedgeford in the 8th century considered themselves to be Anglo-Saxon, I haven't the slightest idea what the answer to that question would be, nor have I the slightest idea what they would mean by that if they were to self-describe themselves as Anglo-Saxon. And actually, I think that this is the kind of question that archaeology is not particularly good at answering, even if it can be answered in a meaningful way. And yet we've tended to obsess about it in relation to our artifactual assemblages and more generally, I think, the the archaeological database. I'm going to take us back to really a more basic way of approaching material like this, because actually it is packed with meaning. It does have things to tell us. It has hugely significant things to tell us, I think. And I want to try and put our Ipswich ware assemblage, our 4,500 sherds that we've got from this site, part of which is beautifully reconstructed here for us by Dan Secker, though he's actually showing in this particular reconstruction the late Anglo-Saxon phase. Never mind. The point is made that Ipswich ware in the earlier phase in the development of the site is telling us something about what is going on this site and how this site is connected with other places. And in reading the Ipswich ware signature at Sedgeford, it's worth keeping in mind these odd things about the material. Everybody knows this on the call, but it's worth saying it again now, that it is odd stuff. The fact that all of it is made in Ipswich, the fact that in Ipswich it's produced on an industrial scale, and when this industry kicks off, it seems to be the only place in Anglo-Saxon England where there's this kind of industrial scale pottery production. It's highly standardized in form and fabric. I know there are a few bowls and a few bottles, but the vast bulk of it, probably about 95% of it, is jars, and virtually all of the rest consist of pitchers, as I understand it. So a very, very standardized form of pottery, very different, for example, from the huge range of forms that you get typically in a kind of Roman fineware industry, certainly a fineware industry, and to some degree also more broadly. It's virtually the only pottery used in East Anglia between 720 and 850. It seems to drive out the domestic wares, the grass-tempered wares very, very quickly once it begins to arrive on site. And the distribution is very skewed indeed. It's not an even distribution. It was sort of suggested in that distribution map that Hannah put up in her presentation. But here's another little statistic just to indicate how oddly skewed it is. The Sedgeford density is 1 sherd per 2.2 square meters. North Elmham, which of course is unquestionably a very high status site, it's a major monastic site, the density there is only 1 sherd per 75 square meters. And it's not because North Elmham is particularly difficult to get to. It's served by a navigable river. There's no particular reason why the distribution should be skewed in this way, unless there is something about the nature of Ipswich ware and the way in which it's being used and the way it is moving about. I want to say what really matters about Ipswich ware, it's not making statements about cultural identity, I really don't think. It's completely functional, and what it's doing is essentially two things. It's moving stuff about, and it's moving stuff from Ipswich to other places. So it functions as amber, to use an Anglo-Saxon word. It's a container for moving goods around. And then once it's arrived, it obviously gets recycled. It gets recycled into a domestic pottery. So crocker, to use again an Anglo-Saxon word, if you like, it's being used as a storage jar, and it's being used as a cooking pot. And we are certain that that is the case at Sedgeford, as we generally speaking are, where there's any significant quantity of this material, because we can see the burning on the pots, we can see the food residues and so on. So there's no question at all it's being reused, and then it ends up, of course, when it breaks, it ends up in the rubbish accumulations around the settlement. Now I'm going to come back to Ipswich ware at the end of this talk, because I want to use the Ipswich ware I want to sort of fit it into a context which I'm going to try and develop now, which is rooted in the Sedgeford evidence, and then, as I say, zooming out to put Sedgeford into a wider context. My colleagues Ellie and Hannah have said all that really needs to be said about the malting complex itself. Ellie has made it very clear that we possibly have 4 malt houses altogether on the site, possibly even more than that. And Hannah has sort of amplified that by looking at the distributions of grain across the site. So we've got something, we've got industrial scale production of malt. That is completely beyond question. Ellie's already shown this rather nice reconstruction that Adrian Donaghy has done for us. And I like to link this to this image, actually, which I think Hannah did refer to in answering questions. This is the St. Gall plan, the famous St. Gall plan. And I think actually that this is slightly misinterpreted by the editors of the volume, because I think this is a drying kiln. I'm pretty certain that it is. And I think what the artist has done is not drawn the hatching going right the way across so that you can clearly see the kiln underneath. That's a bit of a guess. I don't know that's the case, but it's how I'm inclined to interpret it, given this reconstruction of the malt house, which must be, we are effectively 100% certain this must be how it's working. Now, this is the point, first of all, to make, is that this is very high tech stuff, and this suddenly is there in the landscape. It suddenly appears in the landscape. It's not as if there's a kind of build-up of more primitive versions of this. Suddenly we've got this full-scale malt house at Sedgeford. But that's not all we've got. The malting complex is down here in this sort of gully, and it's because it's in a little gully on the side of the field that it's so well preserved, and we can see clearly how it's all working. But it's linked with other things. It's linked with a grid planned settlement. Now, the geophysics and then the superimposition on the geophysics of the excavated features make it give us a palimpsest, of course. So we have to extract for the time being this D-shaped enclosure, which is a late Saxon, presumably high status imposition on the landscape. The gridded village, and I'm going to call it that, the gridded village continues in use after the D-shaped enclosure has been imposed, but the gridding of the village that you can see here represented very clearly in the excavated features, that predates the late Saxon period. That's dated to the middle Saxon period, and in fact, if we want to put a fairly precise date on things, the years around AD 800, just coming up to AD 800, just after AD 800, is when we see a whole series of things, including the malting complex, but also the imposition of a grid plan, going in at about the same time. There is the phase 5, represented in the plans. I've now extracted this from the palimpsest. That's what we think the settlement sort of looks like, with the associated cemetery up here, at the time when the malting complex is in use. The malting complex is essentially late, middle Anglo-Saxon, which is why I'm sort of saying years around 800. So we've got a grid plan being imposed, and the settlement, the village, being reorganized in this way. And I know John is on the call, John Blair, so thank you, John, for all of your insights into the introduction or reintroduction of grid planning in this period. I mean, John's had a look at our material. We're now more confident than we were when we talked to John about this before, that we can see a short perch grid being imposed on the landscape. We think we can see that clearly represented in the settlement. What David has done here is he's superimposed a short perch grid across our geophysics and our excavated features, as you can see. So not just a malting complex, but a serious engagement with reorganizing the landscape, if you like. And we think that we can even see that extending. This is now a sort of short furlong grid, as I understand it, technically to be a short furlong grid, now being spread out across the landscape as a whole. And if you, and what we've done is we've oriented this, or what David has done, I should say, I can't do this kind of very sophisticated thing with computers. What David has done is he's oriented this on the alignments that we can see on the geophysics of the excavation site and on the features that we have excavated on the settlement site. He's aligned it on that and then looked at the wider landscape. And what he is seeing, I mean, this is work in progress, I must stress it's work in progress, but what he is seeing is elements of a field system surviving much, much later, which do seem to follow those lines, which do seem to conform to that grid. That's the orange lines that you can see there. Now, to my amateur eye, that looks pretty compelling, that we've got bits of that Anglo-Saxon field system based on a grid which has actually been preserved in right up to present times. Now, if this scale of landscape reorganization is going on, then we're talking, we're not just talking about a malting complex, we're talking about something much bigger than that. And we're also talking about the managing of waterways. It's suggested in David's plan here, because we've got this pale blue line that you can see here is the suggestion of the canal, but actually I'm going to use Gary's plan based on David's evidence to try and build this picture and make this picture a little bit more clear. Here is a plan which sort of summarizes what we think is happening round about AD 800. I mean, I imagine it all happening in a period of a few decades, let's say 50 years or so, centered on AD 800. We've got our malting complex, which is using water that is running down the slope from a spring which we think we have identified on the geophysics. So that's our water course supplying the water that is essential to the malting process. But what's happening down here? Here's the, obviously here is the settlement. Ignore the D-shaped enclosure. We put it on just for reference, but it's not there yet. But there is our gridded settlement. And I'm going to say something about the cemetery in a moment. But notice this, this canal that we are now very certain is there, we think is originally Roman and is then refurbished and brought back into use in the Middle Anglo-Saxon period. We think what is also happening is that this very extensive area in here, Reed Dam, is being turned into effectively a mill pond, and then it would serve other purposes as well, but primarily a mill pond. And we can even see a layer of chalk, crushed chalk, which has been deposited at the base of this, and it seems to extend right the way across it as a lining. Now, this is a huge investment of resources to almost certainly facilitate transport down the canal of bulk cargoes, and at the same time to use the river itself, supported by this reserve power supply, as it were, represented by the mill pond, to power down river mills. One or more water mills seems to be the implication. And there, by the way, as we sort of zoom out, there you can see the entire watercourse, this river being managed, and alongside it, where there are mills operating on the river, we're assuming that's why they're bringing this canal back into operation. And you can see that it extends for a considerable distance, several kilometers across the landscape. We're talking about water power and water transport, water power to drive mills downriver. The Reed Dam flooded to create a mill pond, which is reserve power if there's not enough power at certain times in the river. A canal being built or brought back into use, being refurbished, being cleaned out and reused for bulk cargoes to enable those to bypass the mills. The reed dam certainly, and possibly the canal lined with crushed chalk. And Brian, who has been working, he's a retired chartered quantity surveyor, so Brian can make calculations about how much work is represented by these different things we can see. And Brian's working on more stuff at the moment. And one of his conclusions is that you need 171 person weeks of labour in order to excavate and line 1 kilometre of canal. So it's just beginning to give us an indication of just how much labour is being invested in this process. Then when we think about the cemetery, which is, and there are many things to be said about the cemetery, but I'm only going to make one point about it, and that is to use the cemetery to make an estimate of population, which, and I've been helped to do this by Sophie and Lorraine, two of our osteoarchaeologists, who enable me to make this approximate estimate based upon the probable number or the possible number of burials altogether, how long the cemetery is in use, the average life expectancy in the population. And the figure that we've come up with, very, very approximate, let me say, is that possibly a living population of about 300 people might be represented by the cemetery, which could, of course, be serving a wider area than just Sedgeford. We're aware of that, but it's interesting that a doomsday estimate for the population of Sedgeford is bang on with that estimate. So we've got a kind of, we feel we've fairly confident we've got a kind of ballpark of the overall population, something up to about 300 people altogether. What does the cemetery mean? It means that there's a centralized authority, which is implied by other things that are going on, but it also means that there is or implies, if it's serving a relatively tight community, as we assume it must be relatively tight, it means a pooling of labor and resources. And there is strong and growing evidence, I think, from Sedgeford for the use of heavy ploughs and therefore open fields. Hannah has alluded to this already. We discussed who was going to talk about this, and she suggested that I should just list the different bits of evidence, circumstantial evidence, that we've got for the use of a heavy plough. Our plough marks, which cut across the features at the base that represent the malting complex, they cut across the clay floors and they cut across the kilns. They are all north-south plough marks. We don't have any crisscross plough marks. The scoring is deep through the underlying malting complex features. We know, by the way, I must stress this, we know it's a Middle Anglo-Saxon plough soil on top. The plough soil is dated by Ipswich ware. There's nothing later in it at all. We've got a Middle Anglo-Saxon plough soil sitting on top of a Middle Anglo-Saxon malting complex. So the deep scoring that we're seeing is unquestionably a Middle Anglo-Saxon plough. The Middle Anglo-Saxon plough soil is poorly sorted, as if the field goes out of use, and there's then a quick infilling of the gully before the plough soil has time to sort of break down and mix up properly. There is a suggestion, and it's nothing more than that, we can't really prove it at the moment, of diagonal throw in the plough soil section, which would imply, of course, a mould board. Hannah has drawn my attention, and she's now drawn everybody else's attention to the possible significance of stinking mayweed, which I knew absolutely nothing about until about a week ago. Stinking mayweed present in our samples may imply that we've got the working of heavy soils. And of course, serialization, mass production of cereals, an element of monoculture is implicit in the fact that we've got a malting complex. We've almost certainly got watermills. Otherwise, why are they doing all this stuff that they're doing in the river valley? And we've got a canal, presumably for the movement of bulk cargoes. And we've got nucleation to pool labor and resources. Now, why are you wanting to pool labor and resources? Well, particularly you're wanting to do that if you're using a heavy plow and you want 2 ox to pull it, or 2 oxen, or 4 oxen, or 6 oxen, or whatever it is. You pool resources, of course, to enable this kind of thing to be done. This is a Middle Anglo-Saxon Big Bang, round about AD 800, with malting complex, grid planned, a nucleated village, a large ordered, presumably Christian cemetery, probably heavy plows working in open fields, specialized grain production, a managed river, a mill pond and water mills, a canal and therefore barges, presumably moving up and down the canal, a Middle Anglo-Saxon shuffle, because actually there's nothing here before on our site, on our settlement site and our cemetery site, there's nothing there before at the earliest about 650. So wherever people are before about 650, they're not on this site. So this is a shuffle from elsewhere to this location, and surely a Middle Anglo-Saxon agricultural revolution is implied in all of this evidence. A big bang and a big question. We can see what's happening. We can see how it's happening. We have questions which are more difficult to answer to do with who's doing it and why are they doing it. And I want to start with these, what I'm calling these elements of an answer, and this is going to lead me into some comments about mid-Anglo-Saxon political economy. Probably up to 95% of the population of Middle Anglo-Saxon England worked on the land. The economy was based on labour services and food renders. And where we have within that framework specialized production and processing, then the implication is lordship. The implication is that there is some kind of organizing authority. This is not a world of independent subsistence farmers doing their own thing and doing a bit of everything and being largely self-reliant. This is people who are being organized into a much more complex agricultural economy. I did a trawl through a whole series of documents, and I know that there, I knew there were references to food renders in various secondary sources, and I wanted to try and sort of drill down and see if I could what list I could come up with. So this is very amateur. I have to stress I'm not first and foremost a historian, and I'm first and foremost an archaeologist. But I wanted to see how many food renders I could actually find. I came up with I searched 25 documents, but there are actually more render lists altogether, probably about 35 render lists altogether. And each figure that you can see here is a single reference to this type of material. So where ale has the number 14 against it, that means that I have seen ale referred to in 14 separate food render lists. So this is just to get a feel for the kind of stuff that is appearing in the food render list. I use the term food render rather than food rent. I prefer food render because it keeps the emphasis on the fact that it's material, not money, that is actually moving around. And here's the first of a number of sort of controversial asides that I want to throw into this presentation. None of this was being sold. This is about food renders. No money was changing hands. There is no exchange or trade or market involved in food renders. The mid-Anglo-Saxon economy was not a commercial economy. It was not a capitalist economy. It was a tributary economy based on labor services and food renders. There is nothing in the source material to substantiate the idea that this was some kind of proto-capitalism. Nothing at all, really, in the evidence that we have for Middle Anglo-Saxon England to substantiate that. This is a food economy based on labor services and food renders, fundamentally. Most renders, you've just seen my list, most renders were foodstuffs, some other things, but mostly foodstuffs. Most labor services, so where labor services are listed, you know, the things that different tied peasants have to do for the Lord and so on, usually those labor services are labor services in food production. Most other work is food related. Now, if you think about all of these things we've been talking about, actually, think about water mills, think about malt houses, wood for fencing, that appears in the in the renders, canal digging and dredging, which you've got evidence for at Sedgeford, the boat building, which is implicit in the fact that we've got a canal, making pots to move stuff around and sacks to move stuff around and barrels to move stuff around. All of this is related to the production, the processing, the distribution leading up to the consumption of food. The production, processing, distribution, and consumption of food then give rise to food flows. And food flows are the essence of the system. It's like circuits of capital accumulation in a modern economy. The equivalent of that in the Middle Anglo-Saxon world is food flows. The economic and social order was primarily a consequence of these food flows, and control over flows of food surplus was the basis then of elite power. Now, these are, I'm giving another lecture at the FeedSax conference in 3 weeks' time, and these are just bullet points that I've extracted from that other lecture to whet people's appetites, and I hope, you know, people who aren't already signed up for the FeedSax conference will sign up for it. I think it's going to be a very important conference. But among the things that I'm going to develop a little bit in that lecture are these points. Productive sites were not productive. Coins were not used as currency. That does not mean the economy was based on barter. Secular and ecclesiastical lords controlled surpluses, not mercantile capitalists. And though there were merchants and there were markets and there was money of a sort, these were marginal to the economy. They are not fundamental to the way in which this economic system was working. There's my model of how I think the Middle Anglo-Saxon economy in which Sedgeford is embedded was actually functioning. And I divide it into two main tiers. You have a tier of peasant production down here. This is where our 95% of the population are toiling away. And you have a tier of elite appropriation and consumption up here. And when we think about the material and the labor service, so it's both labor services and food renders which are moving upwards in the system, creating a surplus of labor and produce, which is then controlled by the elite, an elite which we can think of in terms of army, in terms of church, and in terms of a kind of elite culture centered on the mead hall, the feasting hall, and an anthropology of gift exchange and so on. This is all flowing upwards. What's happening in terms of emporia and inland markets and craft activity, I've put it over here. I put it over here in a kind of annex because it's completely marginal to what is essentially making this economic system work. Of course, it's the case that a little bit of the surplus that is controlled by the elite is being used for exchange. For example, exchanging things that you can't get in any other way, like imported Rhineland wine, for example. You get that at Ipswich, and you have to exchange that with a Frisian merchant. So a little bit of the surplus is feeding that process, but it's marginal to the essentially what is happening in terms of stuff moving around. Note as well that down at the bottom, where most of us are, in addition to local people producing for their own subsistence, so that's the circular flow that you can see there, there is a reverse flow of provisions. The elite is passing some material that it controls back downwards and creating networks of dependence, so that the social structure, in a sense, is being created around the food flows and held together by the food flows. So this is from food render to food provisioning. Food render is the stuff going up to the elite. Food provisioning is the stuff then coming back down. Consider this famous document that we think dates to about the time of Edward the Confessor, the Rectitudines Singularum Personarum. One of the things that you read there is, there are many common rights. In some districts are due winter provisions, Easter provisions, a harvest feast for reaping corn, a drinking feast for ploughing, reward for haymaking, food for making the rick, at wood carrying a log from each load, at corn carrying, food on completion of the rick, and many other things which I cannot recount. This is about the stuff going back down. These are obligations on the Lord to make payments, in effect payments, for things that people are doing, particularly at certain seasons of the year where there's a heavy call on labour and additional people are being called in to do the harvest or whatever. Food provisions listed elsewhere in the Rectitudines include all of those things that I've listed there. In other words, these are not food renders going up. These are examples of things that are coming down from the lords. These are obligations on the Lord to make payments in kind to the people who are their dependents. And that, of course, is all in addition to the land that you work yourself and the labor you invest on the bit of land that you've got, which you're using for your own subsistence. What is a mid-Anglo-Saxon great lord? He is a personification of food surplus. He is a food mountain. And what he's doing with that food, once he's got that surplus, he's dispersing it in all kinds of different directions to sustain his position as a great lord. Some of this is to do with military obligations up here, for example. Some of it is to do with maintaining his own retinue here. Some of it is to do with his own household here. Some of it is to do with the payments that are being made to the surplus labor that's being brought in at certain moments, and so on. But the picture is clear that we've got a mid-Anglo-Saxon great lord who in a sense is defined by his control over food surplus, and therefore the way in which he's able to generate a series of food flows. There are a few examples just sort of thrown in of food circuits. They're just examples of some of the things that are actually going on as the food moves around the system, and those food circuits create economic connections and social relations both. This is the basic mechanism of the system, culminating, all leading up to food consumption at every different social level. So my concluding slide is this. I'm taking us right back to the Ipswich ware pots. What do our pots signify in the context of what's happening more generally at Sedgeford, and in the context of what is probably going on in the Middle Anglo-Saxon economy more generally? A political economy based on food renders, food work, and food flows. Therefore, a division of East Anglia into greater states where there is growing agricultural specialization and necessarily, therefore, regional connectivity where different places are producing different things. Lordship based on control over food surplus, and a food culture centered on the mead hall, the harvest feast, and the peasant hearth. From amber, in terms of Ipswich, we're at Sedgeford, from amber to crocker to rubbish to the potsherd that we then try and understand. And I hope that's helped us to understand it a little better. I'm done.